In the blinding instant of 8:15 on a quiet August morning in 1945, the city of Hiroshima simply ceased to exist as it had been known for centuries. A single B-29 bomber drifted high above the rooftops where children played and mothers stirred thin rice pots over open flames, its engines a faint drone lost in the summer haze. Then came the flash, not fire, not lightning, but a light so pure and absolute that it etched human shadows onto stone walls forever. Within seconds the air itself ignited. A roaring wind tore through wooden homes like paper, and a towering column of smoke and fire climbed into the sky, like some vengeful god awakening. This was no ordinary bomb. This was the end of an era, delivered in silence before the thunder even reached the ground. The old world, the one where wars were fought with steel and courage and numbers, died in that white flash, replaced by something colder, more final, more absolute. Yet in those first stunned minutes, as survivors staggered through streets of ash and flame, no one could grasp that the collapse had already begun, not with armies clashing, but with a single device no larger than a man's torso that had rewritten every rule humanity thought it understood about power and survival. The atomic bomb had spoken, and the echoes would never fade. The world that existed before that morning had been locked for 6 years in the most savage conflict humanity had ever known. Europe lay in ruins, its cities reduced to rubble by conventional bombs and artillery, its populations exhausted by rationing and fear. In the Pacific, the war had taken on a brutal, personal ferocity. Island after island fell only after fanatical resistance, each beach soaked in blood from both sides. Japan, once an empire stretching across Asia, now fought with its back to the home islands, its navy largely sunk, its air force reduced to desperate kamikaze missions. Yet the daily rhythm of life still clung to routine. In American factories, women welded Liberty ships under harsh fluorescent lights, while husbands shipped overseas. In Japanese cities, families tended vegetable patches and bomb craters, and listened to propaganda broadcasts promising divine victory. The war felt endless but still comprehensible, a struggle of resources, territory, and will. No one spoke of weapons that could erase entire cities in the time it took to draw breath. The era of conventional global war still held its terrible logic, and most believed that logic would decide the outcome. Beneath that surface, however, forces were aligning that would shatter the very foundation of that era forever. Scientists had been chasing the atom's secrets for decades, but the invisible warnings began in earnest in the late 1930s. In a Berlin laboratory in 1938, German chemists split the uranium nucleus for the first time, releasing energy that stunned the world of physics. Word spread among refugee scientists fleeing Nazi persecution, men like Leo Szilard and Enrico Fermi who understood exactly what chain reactions could mean if turned into weapons. A quiet letter reached President Roosevelt in 1939, warning that Germany might already be pursuing an atomic bomb. The United States, still neutral and focused on isolation, began modest research. Few outside a handful of laboratories noticed. Daily life continued unchanged for ordinary citizens. Children went to school, farmers harvested crops, and soldiers trained with rifles and bayonets. The warnings remained confined to blackboards and classified memos. Yet the first cracks in the old order were already forming, invisible to all but those who could calculate the terrible arithmetic of fission. The collapse did not begin with chaos, it began quietly, in the minds of men who realized that the laws of nature themselves had been weaponized. By 1942, the invisible had become a frantic race. The Manhattan Project swallowed billions of dollars and thousands of the brightest minds, hidden inside newly built secret cities carved from American wilderness. In Oak Ridge, Tennessee, entire factories the size of small towns purified uranium in silence. At Los Alamos, New Mexico, physicists worked under armed guard, their families living in makeshift wooden houses while they calculated yields and critical masses. Daily life for these men and women was one of intense secrecy and pressure. Letters home were censored, conversations monitored, and the weight of an uncertain future pressed on every calculation. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japanese civilians endured firebombing raids that turned Tokyo into a sea of flames, yet still clung to the belief that spirit could triumph over material. The tension rose steadily, almost imperceptibly at first. Each successful test, each purified gram of fissile material, brought the old world closer to its end. No one outside the project knew the scale of what was being built. The public still believed the war would be won by ships and planes, and the courage of young men storming beaches. But the system that had governed warfare for millennia was already failing under the pressure of pure scientific possibility. Key decisions were made in rooms far from the front lines, under pressures few could fully comprehend. Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945, leaving Harry Truman, a man who had never been briefed on the atomic project, suddenly responsible for the most powerful weapon ever conceived. In July, at Potsdam, the Allies issued an ultimatum to Japan demanding unconditional surrender. The Japanese government, fractured and proud, hesitated, hoping for a negotiated peace that would preserve the emperor. Meanwhile, invasion plans for the home islands projected casualties in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps a million. The choice was presented as stark: use the bomb or accept a bloodbath that would dwarf everything seen before. Scientists who had built the weapon now wrestled with moral doubts, yet the momentum was unstoppable. The war machine had its own logic, and the atomic bomb fit perfectly into that logic as the quickest way to force an end. Still, the public knew nothing. Families in both nations continued their routines, writing letters to soldiers, saving grease for munitions, listening to radio reports of distant victories, unaware that the final rupture was only days away. The collapse was accelerating, driven by decisions made in secrecy and haste. The moment the old system truly began to fail came in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945. At the Trinity test site, a tower held the first atomic device ever assembled. Scientists and generals watched from bunkers as the countdown reached zero. What erupted was beyond description: a fireball brighter than the sun, a shockwave that knocked men off their feet miles away, and a mushroom cloud that rose more than 7 miles into the sky. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project's scientific director, later recalled the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." In that instant, the theoretical became real. There was no longer any question of whether humanity could unleash such power, only when and where it would be used. The old era, the one in which war had limits imposed by physics and logistics, cracked wide open. Yet the public still lived in the before. Newspapers carried routine war news. Children played in streets. No one understood what was coming next, because the truth remained locked behind barbed wire and oaths of secrecy. On August 6th, the Enola Gay released its payload over Hiroshima. The city, a military hub but also home to hundreds of thousands of civilians, vanished in a heartbeat. The heat turned skin to liquid and eyes to vapor. Buildings were flattened for miles. A firestorm followed, sucking oxygen from the air and roasting those who had survived the initial blast. Black rain fell later, radioactive and oily, poisoning the wounded who sought shelter. Survivors described a silence so complete it felt like the end of the world, broken only by the moans of the dying. The bomb did not discriminate between soldier and civilian. It erased the distinction entirely. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, its plutonium core creating even greater destruction amid the city's hills. Japan's leadership, stunned by the scale of the catastrophe, finally accepted the reality that continued resistance meant national annihilation. The emperor's voice, broadcast for the first time, announced surrender on August 15th. The war was over, but the collapse had only just begun. The human consequences unfolded in layers of horror that no camera could fully capture. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, hospitals overflowed with patients whose bodies were covered in burns and whose hair fell out in clumps from radiation sickness. Children searched for parents among the ruins, their faces scarred beyond recognition. Entire families were reduced to names on lists of the missing. The social fabric that had held Japanese society together through years of war tore apart under the weight of sudden, incomprehensible loss. Across the ocean, Americans celebrated victory, yet a new unease settled in, the knowledge that the weapon they had used could one day be turned against them. The world watched in stunned silence as photographs of the mushroom cloud circulated. Governments began to realize that the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Old alliances fractured under the strain of this new reality. The collapse, was not merely military, it was psychological, cultural, and civilizational. People who had lived through the worst war in history now confronted something worse: the possibility that the next war would leave no victors at all. In the months and years that followed, the long-term historical impact revealed itself with chilling clarity. The United States briefly held a monopoly on atomic weapons, but the Soviet Union detonated its own device in 1949, shattering any illusion of permanent supremacy. An arms race began that consumed trillions and produced arsenals capable of destroying civilization many times over. The era of total war between great powers ended, not because humanity had grown wiser, but because the cost had become unthinkable. Proxy conflicts replaced direct confrontation, yet the shadow of the mushroom cloud hung over every diplomatic crisis. Cities that had been rebuilt after conventional bombing now planned evacuation routes for nuclear attack. Schools taught children to duck and cover under desks, a ritual born of pure terror. The atomic bomb had not only ended one war, it had ended the very possibility of another world war fought under the old rules. Empires that once measured strength in battleships now measured it in megatons. The rupture was complete, and there was no returning to the world that existed before August 1945. Yet even as the dust settled and treaties were signed, the deeper collapse continued beneath the surface of daily life. Scientists who had celebrated the bomb's success now warned of radioactive fallout drifting across continents. Environmental damage from testing poisoned remote islands and their inhabitants for generations. Entire populations lived under the constant, low-level anxiety that any political miscalculation could trigger Armageddon. The reflective truth emerged slowly. The atomic bomb had not brought peace, but a fragile, terrifying stability, purchased at the price of perpetual dread. Humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no retreat. The old era, with all its horrors and all its hopes, had been consumed in the same fire that leveled two Japanese cities. What remained was a new and uneasy age, one defined not by the glory of conquest, but by the knowledge that conquest itself could mean extinction. The silence that followed the explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was never truly broken. Decades later, the same skies that once carried the Enola Gay still carry the weight of thousands of warheads on constant alert. Children born long after 1945 grow up knowing that the power unleashed that morning could be released again at any moment by accident or design. The collapse was not a single event, but a process that reshaped every aspect of human civilization, from diplomacy to philosophy, from science to art. We live in the ruins of the old world even as we inhabit the gleaming cities of the new. The atomic bomb did not merely end a war, it ended an era in which humanity could pretend that its weapons had limits. The haunting reality remains that the technology perfected in secret laboratories and delivered from the belly of a bomber now sits in silos and submarines worldwide, waiting. And in quiet moments, when the world seems calm, one cannot help but remember that the rupture happened once, without warning, and that the next time the flash comes, there may be no one left to document the end. The era is gone, the shadow it cast endures,